Thanks for tuning in to our recording of Dr. Ira Helfand from March 22nd. I was very excited for the opportunity to be able to help organize an event like this. My name is Angela and I am a first-year medical student at the University of Maryland. I am also a student advocate with the Chesapeake Chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility. As a young medical student, the threat of nuclear war seems like something in the history books. I never considered nuclear war as a real possibility, but due to recent political events, that threat has resurfaced and is now definitely a real possibility. I think it is important for us to know, as medical students and physicians, what we can do to help eliminate this threat and prevent nuclear disaster. As members of the medical community, we have a responsibility to educate the public and shape policy to protect the health of our communities. There are many ways we can do this, such as those that we heard about during this session. The medical student advocates for Chesapeake Physicians for Social Responsibility have recently focused on writing testimony for several climate-related bills, and those bills are currently doing great in the Senate and the House. We are hoping to soon host a workshop breaking down this process to help other medical students get involved.
Before I introduce Dr. Helfand, I'm going to be sort of talking about him through this introduction. I want to give you a background into PSR, our history. I think it'll give context and it'll make a little bit more sense. So after a lecture on the health threats of nuclear weapons, a group of young Harvard doctors formed Physicians for Social Responsibility. It was 1962. There was almost no health data on the effects of nuclear weapons, so they did some research. And with the support of the editor of the New England Journal, they published a very influential set of articles in May of 1962. Some of the names are fairly eminent. Dr. Bernie Lown, for example, was the inventor of the defibrillator. And Dr. Geiger, I don't know if his name shows up here, he had an important role in preventive medicine and community medicine. Dr. Victor Seidel was very important in social medicine. So the article concluded with this, and this has really been, part of our understanding in PSR now for 60 years. And I'll just read it. Physicians charged with responsibility for the lives of their patients and the health of their communities must also explore a new area of preventive medicine, the prevention of thermonuclear war. Well, this publication occurred in May, and in October, the Cuban Missile Crisis exploded on the scene. Terrible use of words, but suddenly PSR became an instant authority on the medical consequences of nuclear war. Some of the good outcomes of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and maybe to give us some hope, because neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy wanted a nuclear war, and I think they both had some good advice about the consequences. So, definitely the best outcome was there was no nuclear war, but possibly related is the atmospheric test ban was signed, a phone line between Kremlin and Washington, all within a year, and the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in July of 1968. So I'm going to fast forward to the 70s. PSR became somewhat dormant in the decade after that. But in the late 70s, Dr. Ira Helfand, our speaker, and Dr. Helen Caldecott met at, there was an attempt to stop a nuclear power plant from opening. And so they met there, and Dr. Caldecott suggested the need for an organization with more weight to the medical arguments against about the nuclear risks. And then they found out about the PSR from 1962. They reconnected, they took the name PSR, and they got some of the older people like Dr. Lown and Dr. Geiger and Dr. Seidel to reconnect. They reconnected with them. And Dr. Lown urged that they really focus on nuclear weapons issue. And that's what they did. Now, while Dr. Helen Caldecott was an inspiration to so many of us in the last century, so many of us now with gray hair, And I could ask people to raise their hand who got involved in this after hearing Dr. Helen Caldecott speak. Dr. Helfand has been that inspiration for a new generation of activists. So they kind of passed the mantle from Dr. Caldecott to Dr. Helfand. But so PSR was reborn, and so was the activism of the initial founders of PSR. And in 1979, this is so interesting, Dr. Lown and a Soviet cardiologist to Gorbachev named Eugeny Chazov, with some other physicians, formed the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War to educate people and leaders around the world about the dangers of nuclear war. Now, at this time, the arms race between the Soviet Union and the US was heating up, and nuclear armed missiles were facing off between the Warsaw Pact and the NATO in Europe, with 10 minutes to launch. And the IPPNW doctors, including Dr. Lown and Dr. Chazov, met with President Reagan and President Gorbachev. IPPNW was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. In 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Missile Treaty, which removed intermediate range missiles from Europe and may have prevented nuclear war in the 80s. And IPPNW played a role influencing Gorbachev, but Reagan was probably influenced more by this 1 million people in New York City in 1982. It was the biggest demonstration that had ever happened in the United States. It may still be the biggest demonstration. I don't know if the Women's March right after a president who will remain unnamed came into office. So IPPNW then in 2007 launched ICAN, which is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. Now, Dr. Helfand is the immediate past president of IPPNW and was on the board of IPPNW when ICAN was formed. And Dr. Helfand chaired some meetings at the UN when the campaign to abolish, when the UN decided to take on the treaty, work on the treaty, to put together a treaty to abolish nuclear weapons. Dr. Helfand chaired the meeting that led to the negotiations for the treaty. So the last slide I'll show you is Dr. Helfand with Setsetso Thurlow. So she received the Nobel Prize for ICAN. In 1945, she was 12 years old in Hiroshima. And though not all the members of her family survived, she did. And her work's mission has been to abolish these nuclear weapons. And one of the happiest days in her life was when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was agreed upon by 122 nations in July of 2017. But I get ahead myself. I want to introduce Dr. Helfand. He has been the inspiration for so many people. He's been at so many important junctures guiding us in what we can do to abolish nuclear weapons. So I will stop sharing and turn it over to Dr. Helfand.
Well, Gwen, first of all, thanks very much for that history of the important role that physicians have played in the efforts to prevent nuclear war. This is not a new idea. This is something which the medical community has recognized as a responsibility for decades now, and one which I hope that the new generation of medical students will take up as well. And thank you also for the very kind words of introduction. I do want to note that I see in the audience Dr. Tilman Ruff, the co-president of IPPNW, currently from Melbourne, Australia, who was actually the founder of ICAN, and to whom enormous credit is due for the work that he has done to move us forward in this last 15 years. We have spent the last, 30 years, all of us, essentially denying the reality of the nuclear danger. Even those of us who spoke often about the danger, in our hearts did not believe that a nuclear war could actually take place. And we paid a terrible price for that act of denial because it played a significant role in keeping us from eliminating these weapons. And now, events in Ukraine in most dramatic fashion have shown the enormity of the danger and the imminence of the danger that these weapons pose to us. There are several ways that the crisis in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, could lead to nuclear war. And let me describe them briefly. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about what such a war would look like, and then what we can do in this situation. The most direct way that the Ukraine war could lead to nuclear conflict would be if Vladimir Putin accelerates the pace of his assault on the people of Ukraine by using nuclear weapons. Russian military doctrine specifically allows for the use of nuclear weapons if they're necessary to gain advantage on the battlefield. Russia has about 2,000 tactical or battlefield nuclear weapons that are meant specifically to be used in a war situation. And Putin has threatened repeatedly during this crisis in a totally unprecedented way to use nuclear weapons. At other times in the past, both Russia and the United States have brandished their nuclear sword during various crises, but never in the way that Putin has over the last month. So that is one potential way that this conflict could turn nuclear. Secondly, because of the increased tension at this moment, we could have a false alarm accidentally trigger a nuclear war. There have been many false alarms over the decades. On at least 6 occasions, those false alarms have brought us to within minutes of nuclear war. But there have been many other false alarms as well, which weren't so dangerous because they occurred at a time when there was not an international crisis. And the people receiving the false alarm quite reasonably looked at the data coming in on their radar screens and said, this doesn't make sense. There's no reason why the other side would be attacking us right now. Let's look into this further before we respond. If a false alarm were to take place today, either because of a computer glitch or perhaps because of a terrorist cyber attack, it is not clear that either the NATO or Russian side would react with that kind of caution and equanimity. There's a much greater chance that they would be concerned this was a real attack and would respond to it. So that's the second way that this could escalate into a nuclear war. And the third way is that the conflict could spill over from Ukraine's borders to involve NATO. The Russians have attacked targets within 12 miles of the Polish border with long-range missiles. If those missiles had overflown their target and landed in Poland, it would have been an attack on NATO. And Article 5 of the NATO treaty requires that an attack on one nation in NATO is treated as an attack on all the nations in NATO. It's not clear if something like that happened, how NATO would respond. If Russia escalates further and begins to carry out sustained attacks on targets in Poland or Hungary or Slovakia or Romania, sites that are being used to funnel aid to the Ukrainians, this could very much escalate into a war between Russia and NATO. And in that case, the chance of this escalating further to nuclear war would be very great indeed. So for all of these reasons, for the first time in decades, we are facing the real possibility of a large-scale nuclear war between the United States and Russia. What would that look like? Most of us have images in our minds of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We've seen pictures. The destruction there was terrible, and it serves as an important warning to us about the danger that these weapons pose. But the most important thing for us to remember about Hiroshima and Nagasaki is that they do not begin to prepare us for the destruction that would take place in a modern nuclear war, because it would not be one relatively small bomb on 1 or 2 cities. If NATO and Russia go to war, it's going to be many weapons on many cities. And most of those weapons will be anywhere from 10 to 50 times larger than the bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. To imagine what this would look like in the case of a large city like New York or Moscow that might be targeted, let me use a model of a single 20 megaton bomb. Now, we don't know for sure what the targeting strategy is for either side, but it is believed that major cities like New York and Moscow are targeted by at least 15 to 20 bombs, probably half megaton in strength, at least each of them. It may be more than that. I was told a few years ago that the United States targets Moscow with still 100 nuclear warheads. But the model of a single 20 megaton explosion, even though it tends to slightly underestimate the destruction that we actually expect would take place, serves to adequately give us a picture of what we're dealing with. Within a thousandth of a second, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction. Within this area, temperatures would approach the temperature on the surface of the sun, and everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude can destroy anything that human beings can build. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, wood, plastic, heating oil, gasoline, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires which would coalesce over the next half hour into a giant firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperatures would rise to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, we're talking about 12 to 15 million people dead in a half an hour. And again, if this were a large-scale war between the United States and NATO, between NATO and Russia, this level of destruction would occur in every major city in the United States, in Russia, in Canada, and in most of the great cities in Europe. Perhaps 200, 300, 400 million people dead in an afternoon. In addition, the entire economic infrastructure that people in all of these countries rely on would be destroyed. There'd be no electric grid, there'd be no internet, there'd be no food distribution system, there'd be no banking system, there'd be no system to distribute fuel oil and gasoline, there'd be no public health system. In the months following this initial attack, the vast majority of people who survived the initial bombing would also die as a result of famine, epidemic disease, radiation poisoning, exposure. These are just the direct effects in the countries that are targeted. A war between NATO and Russia at current force levels would put something like 150 million tons of soot in the upper atmosphere. That would block out the sun and drop temperatures across the planet to levels that we have not seen since the coldest moment of the last ice age. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, temperatures would drop 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And under those conditions, the ecosystems which have evolved since the last ice age would collapse, food production would stop, and the vast majority of the human race would starve to death. Now, this is not the plot to a grade B movie. This is the danger we have lived with every day that we have allowed nuclear weapons to exist. And it is a danger which we face in greatly intensified form right now because of the invasion of Ukraine. What can we do in this situation? Well, to affect the immediate situation, there's not a lot that we can do. Events are moving very quickly, and we have very little leverage over the governments involved in this situation. IPPNW has launched a petition on the global platform Avaz that calls on NATO and Russia to both explicitly state that they will not use nuclear weapons in this conflict. And I would urge you all to sign it. I'll put in the chat in a few minutes the web link to the petition. But in truth, our ability to affect the immediate situation is very, very limited. However, if we are lucky enough to survive this crisis, and it is going to be luck primarily that determines if we are or not, if we are lucky enough to survive this crisis, we need to take action to make sure we are never in a situation like this again, that we never again face this kind of danger. And that we can do, because nuclear weapons are not a force of nature. They are simple machines that we have built with our own hands, and we know how to take them apart, and we need to summon the will to do that. Internationally, the peace community, led by ICANN, and with the cooperation of a number of key governments, have created the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was voted for by 122 nations at the UN in the summer of 2017. It's now been ratified by 59 countries, and it entered formally into force in January of last year. This treaty bans not just the use of nuclear weapons, but the simple possession of them. It is the key to eliminating them worldwide, and we need to universalize this treaty and get every nation to sign it. Of course, the 9 countries which have nuclear weapons have not been party to this process. They have refused to participate. And so that is our essential task right now, to get these countries to take the steps which they need to take so that they will eliminate their weapons and can join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Here in the United States, we've launched the Back from the Brink campaign, which, as its central pillar, calls on the United States government to initiate negotiations now with all 8 of the other nuclear armed states for a verifiable, enforceable, time-bound agreement to eliminate their nuclear weapons so that all 9 countries can disarm and can join the TPNW. I think this is a vehicle which we can all use and which has the potential for bringing about the fundamental change in US nuclear policy that is necessary. And I would urge you all to be engaged in this. As we go forward from the Ukraine crisis, assuming again that this does not end with a nuclear war, 2 narratives are going to emerge. On the one hand, there are going to be people who are saying this war just proves that countries need to arm themselves to the teeth. Ukraine should have had nuclear weapons. They wouldn't have had to worry about the Russians attacking them. On the other hand, is a narrative which we need to promote that says that we need to recoil from this moment. We need to understand how close we have come to the absolute destruction of civilization and make sure this doesn't happen again. And there's a reason to believe that that narrative can triumph. As Gwen pointed out, Dr. Du Bois, in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev were horrified by how close they had brought the world to destruction. And within less than a year, the test ban treaty had been signed, the hotline had been established, and we were on the path towards the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. So it is possible that from this terribly dangerous crisis, we can emerge with progress towards nuclear disarmament, but this is not going to come automatically. We're going to have to really work at it. And I think, at the moment, I think there's a great sense of despair. People watch this brutal invasion of Ukraine. They're horrified by the scenes of what the Russian military is doing to civilian targets in Ukraine, and they feel powerless, like there's little we can do. When they look at the problem of nuclear weapons, it looks even bigger. What can we do about this? I think what we need to understand is we can do a great deal. In the early 1980s, in the United States, in Europe, in the Soviet Union, in Japan, and in Australia, millions of people came together to demand an end to the Cold War arms race. We did not think we would succeed. I think most of us assumed that we were doing what we were doing because we had to do it, but probably there was going to be a nuclear war because that's what the experts were telling us. But we did succeed. We were able to convince, against all the odds, the leaders of the United States and the Soviet Union that they needed to change path, that they needed to stop the Cold War arms race. And I think we can bring about the same fundamental change in nuclear policy today, but it's going to require an enormous amount of work on the part of all of us. And to the medical students and young doctors in the audience, this is a job which I think falls particularly on our shoulders because this is fundamentally a public health problem. And what we have learned in the last decade in negotiating the TPNW is the enormous power of the medical message. Normally, discussions about nuclear weapons take place as though we're talking about some complicated game of chess. And that leads to endless discussion and endless proliferation of nuclear weapons. When we change the terms of the conversation, when we focus it on what is going to happen if these weapons are used, everything changes. We get a different conversation and we get a different outcome because when people understand what these weapons will do when they are used, there's only one conclusion that they can draw. They must be eliminated. So I would urge all of us to look at this moment not only as a terrible disaster, but also as perhaps an opportunity to create something different in the aftermath. And it is an enormous responsibility that we are all carrying at this point in time. But as I always point out when I'm speaking, especially to students and young people, we have been given the opportunity to save the world, literally. And there is absolutely nothing better that anyone can do with their life. And so let's take up this challenge in that spirit. And let's go out and do the work we need to do. And let's save the world. Thank you.
Well, Dr. Helfand, thank you so much. You know, that you can take us to face the abyss of nuclear war, and then, you know, that there's hope and there's what we can do. That's quite a journey. It would be helpful if people would put some questions in the chat that we can ask Dr. Helfand. So let's see. Do you see that there's maybe there's hope with President Biden, for example, that he has knowledge, just like maybe President Kennedy did, that he might be open to listen to our message?
Gwen, that's a great question. And by the way, I did just put in the chat the web address for the IPPNW petition that I mentioned before. You know, President Biden probably understands nuclear weapons better than any president in history. He's been dealing with these issues for decades. And he has made statements that suggest that he is quite open to the idea that these weapons need to be eliminated. In 2017, just before he left office as vice president, he called on the United States to lead a global effort to eliminate nuclear weapons. He said it was our moral responsibility after what we did at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think that we should take encouragement from that he understands this. We should hold him to that pledge that he made. And we need to both give him space to take this action, and we need to pressure him to take this action. Because obviously there's going to be fierce opposition from the nuclear industrial complex to any effort to eliminate nuclear weapons. And the president would need as much support as we could possibly give him if you were inclined to take action in that direction. We also have to understand this is a problem we deal with all the time. I think Obama also indicated some interest in actually eliminating nuclear weapons, but it got pushed to the back burner. There are so many other competing issues. And so part of our job is to make sure this doesn't get pushed to the back burner again, but to keep it on the front burner and make sure that the president attends to it with the energy and attention that is necessary.
Thank you, Dr. Helfand. This is from Mary Melody, an MS4 in Maryland. I'm not sure. Is that a fourth-year medical student? What has been the response of legislators, politicians, and world leaders to this medical argument for the prohibition of nuclear weapons? Yeah. Well, and what are the solutions to talk to them if there is a negative response?
No, the response is actually good when you get a chance to talk to people. You know, that was on an international level, that was our experience during the campaign to achieve the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. At the several conferences on the humanitarian impact, when we spoke about what would happen if nuclear weapons were used, if there were a nuclear war, I think it had a very profound impact on the people who heard that message. We have also the experience that Professor Lown had when he was able to meet with Gorbachev in the 1980s. Gorbachev reported in his memoirs that this was a turning point in his thinking about nuclear war and nuclear weapons. And similarly, Helen Caldicott had a chance to meet with President Reagan, who at the time was the most hawkish president we'd ever had with regards to nuclear weapons. And her visit with him and other outside factors were able to completely change his thinking about these weapons. So I think that the argument is enormously powerful when we're able to deliver it, and that's the key. How do we get them to listen to us? That's not easy. As I said, there are many other issues that are competing for their attention, and they often only listen if they're getting pressed to listen by a lot of their constituents. So in addition to directly reaching out to political leaders, we need to build a public support that makes us impossible to ignore. And that's what the Back from the Brink campaign is designed to do, by getting organizations to sign on to this campaign, by getting cities and towns to sign on to this campaign, by getting local public officials to sign on. And at this point, I believe it is 59 cities and towns across the country have endorsed the campaign, including major cities like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Boston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Honolulu, Salt Lake City, Tucson, Minneapolis. 6 state legislative bodies have endorsed the campaign. Over 300 local elected officials have endorsed the campaign. We are hoping to introduce a resolution in the Congress in coming weeks. We've been in conversation both with my Congressman Jim McGovern, and just today with the staff of Senator Elizabeth Warren to discuss the possibility of getting a resolution introduced into the Congress, which we would then be able to use to organize public support for this.
Great. That's really very exciting. And just for people in Maryland to know, yeah, Baltimore was the first major city. It was on August 6th of 2018 that unanimously the Baltimore City Council passed back from the brink. Montgomery County became the first county in the country to pass back from the brink. That was that was December of 2019. And now, those of you who are in Prince George's County, you might want to send me a note through chat, because we're meeting with one of the councilmen tomorrow, and we already have a sponsor for Prince George's County resolution back from the brink. And people in Frederick City have begun putting together a draft, and they have the support of the mayor, who signed a back from the brink petition. And so, our goal is we're going to get it through Maryland, through the assembly in Maryland. But first we have to get a few more counties and cities under our belt. So, please send me, Gwen Du Bois, an email if you're interested. I mean, a chat if you're interested in attending the meeting tomorrow afternoon. Dr. Milholland asked, would a good start be to take the land-based weapons off hair trigger alert?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that these weapons remain on hair trigger alert in both the United States and Russia is really crazy. They make the weapons much more vulnerable to a cyber attack. They make them much more vulnerable to an impulsive decision by a national leader. And, we have a situation now where in the space of 5 years, both of the great nuclear arsenals in the world, the US and the Russian, have been commanded by people whose mental stability is being questioned widely. First we had Trump in the United States, and now we have Putin. And for many years, Putin was viewed as a sober, careful, deliberate leader. Many people are now raising questions about his mental stability, and it's pretty horrifying to think that these weapons could be launched on the basis of an impulsive decision by somebody who has mental health issues.
Luke tells me that, Ira, if you can resend the link, let me see.
I did.
Okay.
I just resent it to everyone. Sorry.
Okay. Deborah Cunningham asked if you could clarify, why would it get so cold in the central United States after the initial bombings?
Well, the smoke blocks out the sunlight, and that's what keeps the planet warm. Temperatures across the planet fall, but the oceans tend to act as heat sinks. Water has a much higher specific heat than air or land does. And so the areas on the coasts don't cool down quite as quickly as the interior regions do. The cooling is worldwide, but it's most intense in the interior regions of large land masses.
Jeff Kaplan asks, Dr. Helfand, if you can talk about the U.S. role in Ukrainian denuclearization.
Yeah, at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union broke up, there were several thousand nuclear warheads that were stationed in Ukraine. The new Ukrainian government actually never had control of these weapons. They were physically on Ukrainian soil, but they were still controlled by remnants, if you will, of the former Soviet military. But there was a great deal of concern about these weapons, and also large numbers of weapons in the Russian portion of the Soviet Union and in Kazakhstan and Belarus. Security was very poor. There was concern that these weapons could be stolen by terrorists, that bad things could happen. And there was a general agreement that it would be best to get the weapons back, at least under the central control of the Russian military, which was the successor to the Soviet military. The United States was party to an agreement with Ukraine, Russia, and the United Kingdom in 1994, under which the Ukrainian government returned all of the nuclear weapons to Russia. As part of that agreement, Russia guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and UK and US did as well. And it's one of the most horrible aspects of this war that by breaking that guarantee, Russia has sent a message loud and clear to many countries around the world that you might be better off in the short run, at least, with nuclear weapons than with not having nuclear weapons. There are things fundamentally wrong with that argument, but you can see the superficial attraction of it. And one of the consequences of this decision on the part of Putin to violate that agreement, violate international law and invade Ukraine, is that many countries around the world, I think, are probably having second thoughts about whether they want to proliferate. Most probably, and most worrisomely, this may be the case in Taiwan, which is fully aware of China's stated intention of reunifying the island with the mainland, if forced by necessary. And so, in fact, had Ukraine maintained its nuclear arsenal, I don't think it would have made much of a difference in the current situation. They never actually had control of the weapons. If they had had control, this may have already turned into a nuclear war.
Just for your information, Dr. Helfand, Dr. Kaplan's, this is the Kaplan, I think, his father was executive director of the Pugwash Conference that Einstein set up to try to rid us of nuclear weapons. So another question is, shouldn't we be negotiating first and then worrying about everything else?
I'm not sure.
Negotiating, I guess, the end of the conflict with Russia.
Well, I think that everyone is hoping for a negotiated end to the war. Putin has made it quite clear in the last few days that he's not interested in negotiating until he strengthens his position on the ground. And one hopes that they will be able to negotiate a ceasefire as soon as possible. IPPNW has joined with 15 other Nobel laureates in issuing a plea that is part of the petition that I referenced before, that calls for an immediate ceasefire and the immediate withdrawal of all Russian occupying forces from Ukraine, and calls again for NATO and Russia to both give explicit pledges that they will not use nuclear weapons, and then to proceed to support the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So I think clearly we need to have a negotiated settlement, but Putin does not appear to be interested in one now, and it's not clear that he was interested in one before. He just chose to launch this war instead.
Colin, let's see, was it Colin Scott? He wants more knowledge about these smaller nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, to understand. Is it a euphemism to call them small nuclear weapons? It's an oxymoron.
It's a bit of an oxymoron. These weapons are not small, but they are significantly smaller than what we think about. The Hiroshima bomb was about 15 kilotons. Some of the tactical nuclear weapons in the US arsenal are as small as 0.3 kilotons, so quite a bit smaller than the Hiroshima bomb. They still cause enormous destruction. They're still much larger than any conventional weapons. And the danger with tactical nuclear weapons is that they invite use. Because they're smaller, one could imagine someone thinking, well, I really want to use this weapon and I think I can get away with it. It won't lead to a worldwide nuclear war. And I guess that's even possible. Putin could use a tactical nuclear weapon, either on the battlefield in Ukraine, or maybe he could launch one into the sea as a demonstration of his resolve to use nuclear weapons if necessary. And it might go unchallenged. There might not be a nuclear response from the NATO side, but we sure don't know that. And I think the point is that once these weapons are used, we've broken the firewall that has existed since Nagasaki. And we really, literally do not know what is on the other side of that wall. The war games that have been conducted that we have some public knowledge about suggest that in almost all cases where a single tactical nuclear weapon is used, the war rapidly escalates to large-scale nuclear war. And so the real concern here is that these become part of a slippery slope that helps the world transition from a conventional war to a large-scale nuclear war.
I want to share with you, Mary Malati, a fourth-year medical student, said, "Thank you for sharing your experience talking to leaders I'm hopeful. And so it's you know, hope is what we need to leave here with. The task is overwhelming, but it's not hopeless. And this is really, you know, important work, maybe our life's work. And on that spirit, Dr. Peter Gorman, who's a professor at University of Maryland, asked, would it be helpful considering approaching deans of U.S. schools of medicine to join in this Back from the Brink effort? Could this be envisioned?
It's a great idea. We did approach many of the deans of schools of public health and medical schools about 5 or 6 years ago for a statement about the TPNW. I don't think we have in an organized way approached them about the Back from the Brink campaign, and I think it would be a great thing to do. Historically, the deans and of medical schools and other prominent medical professors, editors of journals and so on, have played a very important role in mobilizing the medical community to work on this issue. So I think that would be an excellent idea and something that we should figure out how to pursue. It would be an excellent project for PSR, a national PSR, to take on in coordination with our various PSR chapters.
This is a difficult one from Subhash Gupta, and it's with NATO having so many conventional weapons as well as nuclear weapons, how will non-NATO nations proceed without NATO taking a giant step?
Well, I think NATO is going to need to take a giant step. You know, all of the countries are going to need to get rid of their nuclear weapons. Now, in the 1970s and 80s, the problem was the Warsaw Pact was conventionally much stronger than NATO. And so the US and NATO wanted to hold on to their nuclear weapons as a hedge against the conventional superiority of the Warsaw Pact. That's reversed now. NATO is conventionally much strong in terms of conventional weapons, much stronger than Russia is. And that's going to have to be taken into account in the negotiations to get rid of these weapons. All the countries that have them cite various security concerns as the reason why they keep their nuclear weapons. And those security concerns are going to need to be addressed. And it's not going to be easy. But, you know, we don't have a choice. We have been inordinately lucky so far to avoid a nuclear war. And our luck is not going to hold out indefinitely. I think it is truly, if we don't get rid of these weapons, not a question of if, but a question of when. And so somehow or other, we need to figure out how to achieve this negotiation. Again, though, there is an enormous underlying logic in favor of it, because if we don't get rid of these weapons, they are going to be used. And that is in absolutely no one's interest. That's what happened in the 1980s. Despite the enormous tension between the US and the Soviet Union, both Gorbachev and Reagan were able to get it, that it was not, despite all the enmity, all the problems between the two countries, there was nothing that warranted a nuclear war which would destroy both of them. And that logic exists today, even as it did then. It's a question of helping the leadership in all these countries understand that logic. And that's our job. We need to figure out how to speak to them directly when we can, and mobilize the public to speak to them when we can't have a direct conversation, or in addition to the direct conversations that we have.
There's a question from Luke Mayhew, how you would assess the strength of our current grassroots disarmament movements, and are they developing new leadership? So, you know, how, and diversity and issues like that.
You know, I think that the current anti-nuclear movement is a pale shadow of the movement that existed in the 80s. But it's kind of like the movement that existed in the late 70s, which grew into the movement in the 80s. And so, although it is a relatively small movement still today, I think it is quite possible, we've already seen it happen historically, it is quite possible to rapidly build up a large movement. And the current moment, the current war in Ukraine may well give significant impetus to that effort. It is dramatizing to a generation of people who never thought about this problem, that they need to start thinking about the problem. I think we need to lead very strongly with a medical message. People need to understand what is at stake here. And I think if we are able to deliver that message, we can build this movement just as we did back in the 80s. I think it's going to be very important to figure out how to talk to young people about this issue, because they have not been educated about it. You know, back in the 80s, because of the constant discussion of nuclear war and the way it was usefully portrayed in mass media, movies, books, songs. It was on people's minds, and people made a point of understanding what nuclear war was all about. In the 30 years since the end of the Cold War, that hasn't happened. And people have grown up who just have never been taught, what a nuclear war would be like. So we need to figure out how to reach that large group of young people who have such passion about the existential threat, the climate crisis, that they do understand. I'm quite confident that if we're able to explain and teach this generation the enormity of the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons, they will share a similar enthusiasm for getting rid of them and dealing with that problem. And that's been my experience when I've spoken to high schools or colleges. Generally speaking, the audiences have known little about nuclear war before and have been very motivated and very determined to do something about it when they learned how great the danger is.
There was a question that I'm interpreting. It means, what is the effect of the nuclear, it says nuclear stations may have, what impact the bombardment? I think that's nuclear power plants may have.
Yeah, thanks for that question also. I mean, this is another aspect of the war that's really quite terrifying. Ukraine had, at the start of the war, 15 operating nuclear power plants, plus the abandoned plants at Chernobyl. Russian forces targeted Chernobyl, and they targeted the largest nuclear power station in Europe at Zaporozhye. And I'm sure I mispronounced that, but people probably know what I'm referring to. There are 6 nuclear reactors there, and Russian forces actually opened fire and with artillery and caused a fire there. This is an extremely dangerous situation. Nuclear power plants are dangerous in the best of circumstances. They're certainly not designed to exist in a war zone. And there are many different ways that the fighting that has been launched by the Russian invasion could lead to the meltdown of one or more of these reactors. We could have another Chernobyl type disaster, or even something significantly larger. And I think it is an argument for immediate ceasefire. It is also a strong argument against the development of additional nuclear power plants in the world, because this is not the only potential conflict zone where there are large numbers of nuclear reactors. This should be a wake-up call to us about the danger of building these reactors.
I just want to add to what Dr. Helfand said. It's not only the radioactive fuel in the reactor, which is encased in a vessel, so it has a little extra protection, not 100% protection, but when they unload the fuel to refuel, they put it in a pool that has no kind of vessel containment like the reactor. Not only that, these spent fuel pools have multiple loads of reactor fuel. And so if the containment building is breached and they're not, these pools must have 24/7 electricity and water supplying them. Otherwise, they will overheat and boil away, and then the radioactivity, there could be explosion, it could be evaporated and carried far and wide with radioactive cesium, which in the body acts like potassium, is very dangerous, half-life of 30 years. I mean, this can contaminate an area from one nuclear power plant with its spent fuel pool that could be a large part of Europe. So this is, this is more than playing with fire. Well, the hour we've taken a lot of Dr. Helfand's time and gotten many questions answered. And as I said before, we've I think faced the abyss, but also understand that there is, if we can get through this crisis, then our work really begins. We throw up our hands in prayer, and then we say, okay, now we can't be hostages to nuclear weapons any longer. And thankfully, there's a treaty internationally, and there's Back from the Brink nationally, that we can begin as people demanding from our leaders that we have to change these policies that are from the Cold War. I just want to say, if these policies that with nuclear weapons seem crazy, and why do we still have them? They're very, very profitable to quite a few corporations, and that also fuels them. But we have the numbers. So if we can find hope and join with other people in community and do this work, you know, the outcome can be a good one. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who was here. Thank you, Angela, for making sure this happened, and Dr. Patel. And we thank all the students who were here and all the people who've been so active over the decades working against nuclear weapons. So let's get to work. Any final words, Dr. Helfand?
I just want to reiterate the note of hope that you've just struck, Gwen. This is a huge problem, and it's a scary problem. But you know, I'm an optimistic person. If I didn't think that we could deal with this problem, like many who have been working on this for decades, I would have stopped a long time ago. In my heart, I believe that this is something that we can deal with. And in the process of getting rid of these nuclear weapons, we're going to have to create a new kind of relationship between the countries which have them, which will then spill over into our efforts to deal with the climate crisis. So it is a moment of great danger, but it is also a moment of great opportunity, and a really historic opportunity for us to change the course of history and to save the world. And I hope everyone will view this situation in that light and really be inspired to get involved if you're not already. I put in the chat the web address for the Back from the Brink campaign, and would urge you all to become involved in this. Thanks so much for taking the time and being part of this discussion tonight.
And thank you, Dr. Helfand. Fabulous. Thank you so much. All right, well, this will end our meeting, and but not our work. So thank you all.